Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Perhaps you have had a long day, or perhaps you simply enjoy drifting off while contemplating the strange corners of history rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You do not need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as gravity itself seems to ease its hold. Tonight we travel to one of the most remarkable places that ever existed on this earth, a place that defied every rule of urban planning, challenged the authority of empires, and became home to tens of thousands of people who built an entire world within walls that no longer stood. We are going to explore the history of the Kowloon walled city, a place that existed for over a century as a monument to human adaptability, resilience, and the strange things that happen when governments look the other way. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you are ready, let us begin. The story of the Kowloon walled city begins not in the dense urban chaos that would later define it, but on a quiet peninsula in southern China, where the waters of the Pearl River Delta meet the South China Sea. The Kowloon Peninsula itself takes its name from the Cantonese words meaning 9 dragons, referring to the 8 hills that dot its landscape, with the 9th dragon being the emperor himself who once ruled over all of China. This land has been inhabited for thousands of years, with archaeological evidence suggesting human settlement dating back to the Neolithic period. But our story focuses on a small plot of land, measuring roughly 210 meters by 120 meters, that would become one of the most densely populated places in human history. To understand how the Kowloon walled city came to exist, we must first understand the geography that shaped it. The site sat on the eastern side of Kowloon Bay, in what would eventually become the Kowloon City district of Hong Kong. To the north and northeast rose rugged mountains reaching elevations of over 600 meters. To the south lay Victoria Harbour, and beyond that, Hong Kong Island with its own peaks climbing to similar heights. This geography would prove crucial in the centuries to come, determining everything from military strategy to flight paths that would eventually limit how tall the buildings of the walled city could grow. The earliest recorded use of this site as a military installation dates back to the Song dynasty, which ruled China from 960 to 1279. During this period, the imperial government established a small outpost here to manage and protect the lucrative salt trade that flowed through the region. Salt was one of the most valuable commodities in ancient China, essential for preserving food and maintaining health. The government maintained strict control over its production and distribution, and coastal areas like this one required military presence to prevent smuggling and ensure that taxes were properly collected. For centuries after the Song dynasty fell, the site remained relatively quiet. Historical records show that by 1668, during the early Qing dynasty, approximately 30 guards were stationed at the location. This was not a major military installation but rather a modest outpost, one of many scattered along the Chinese coast to maintain imperial authority over these far-flung territories. The guards likely spent their days monitoring the waters for pirates and smugglers, maintaining the modest fortifications, and waiting for orders that rarely came from the distant capital in Beijing. The transformation of this quiet outpost into something more substantial began around 1810. When Chinese forces abandoned Tunglung Fort, another coastal fortification located on an island to the east. The strategic importance of the Kowloon position increased, and a small coastal fort was established on the site. But the real catalyst for change came in 1842, when the British Empire forced the Qing dynasty to sign the Treaty of Nanjing following China's defeat in the First Opium War. The Treaty of Nanjing ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity, creating a British colony literally within sight of the Chinese mainland. The Qing government watched with growing concern as British ships filled Victoria Harbour and British merchants established trading houses on the island they had just lost. The fort at Kowloon suddenly took on new importance. No longer was it simply a coastal outpost watching for pirates. Now it was a forward position from which Chinese officials could monitor British activities and maintain a presence on the doorstep of the new colony. Recognizing this new strategic reality, the Qing authorities decided to strengthen the fortification substantially. Between 1843 and 1847, they undertook major construction works that would give the site its defining characteristic, the wall that would give the walled city its name. Workers labored to build a formidable defensive structure, a stone wall standing approximately 4 meters tall and 4.6 meters thick at its base. The wall enclosed the entire site, creating a fortified compound with 4 entrance gates facing the cardinal directions. Within these walls, buildings were constructed to house the growing garrison and the administrative officials who governed this strategic position. The improvements reflected the Qing government's determination to maintain its authority in the face of British expansion. The fort was expanded to accommodate not just soldiers but also civil administrators, including an official residence for the magistrate who would oversee local affairs. A yamen, the traditional seat of government in Chinese administrative practice, was established within the walls. This building would serve as both courthouse and administrative center, the place where disputes were settled and imperial edicts were proclaimed. By the time the construction was completed in 1847, the site had been transformed from a minor military outpost into a proper garrison town. The stone walls gave it an air of permanence and authority. Chinese soldiers drilled in the courtyards while bureaucrats kept careful records of the comings and goings in this strategically vital location. The population within the walls remained relatively small, perhaps a few hundred souls including soldiers, administrators, and their families. But the infrastructure for a larger settlement was now in place. The walled city's first major test came during the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. This massive civil war, which raged across China from 1850 to 1864, pitted the Qing dynasty against a revolutionary movement that sought to establish a new heavenly kingdom on earth. The rebellion touched nearly every corner of the empire, and in 1854, rebel forces managed to capture the Kowloon fort. For a few tense weeks, the Taiping banner flew above the walls that had been built to represent Qing authority. The imperial government could not allow such a strategically important position to remain in rebel hands. Forces loyal to the Qing dynasty mounted a counterattack and recaptured the fort within a matter of weeks. The walls had proven their worth, though perhaps not in the way their builders had intended. They had been designed to defend against foreign incursion, but their first real test had come from within China itself. The rebellion would eventually be crushed, though at a cost of millions of lives, and the Kowloon garrison would return to its quiet vigil over Victoria Harbour. The decades following the Taiping Rebellion saw the British colony on Hong Kong Island grow ever larger and more prosperous. The narrow strait separating the island from the Kowloon Peninsula buzzed with merchant ships and naval vessels. British influence spread across the region, and the Qing dynasty found itself increasingly unable to resist foreign demands. In 1860, following China's defeat in the Second Opium War, the British acquired the southern tip of the Kowloon Peninsula through the Convention of Peking. The walled city now sat just north of British territory, a Chinese island in an increasingly British sea. Still, the fort and its surrounding settlement remained firmly under Qing control. Chinese officials continued to administer justice within the walls, and Chinese soldiers continued to patrol the ramparts. The population grew slowly as families of officials and soldiers put down roots. A small civilian community developed, with merchants and craftsmen setting up shop to serve the garrison. Life within the walls followed the rhythms that had governed Chinese towns for centuries: the festivals and ceremonies, the market days and rest days, the cycle of seasons marked by agricultural traditions even in this increasingly urban setting. The transformation that would ultimately define the walled city's character began in 1898, when geopolitics once again reshaped the map of southern China. The late 19th century saw the European powers scrambling to carve out spheres of influence in a weakening Chinese empire. France had established control over Indochina to the south. Germany had forced China to lease the Kiautschou Bay concession in Shandong province. Russia had obtained a lease on Port Arthur and Dalian in Manchuria. Britain, concerned about these rival incursions, sought to strengthen its position in Hong Kong. On June 9, 1898, British and Qing representatives signed the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory. This agreement leased to Britain for 99 years a vast tract of land north of Kowloon, along with more than 200 surrounding islands. This territory, which would become known as the New Territories, increased the size of the British colony tenfold. The lease was set to expire on June 30, 1997, a date that seemed impossibly far in the future but would eventually become one of the most significant moments in Hong Kong's history. Crucially, however, the 1898 convention contained an exception. The Kowloon walled city was specifically excluded from the lease. China would be permitted to maintain officials there as long as their presence did not interfere with the defense of Hong Kong. This clause, inserted at Chinese insistence, created one of the most peculiar jurisdictional anomalies in modern history. The walled city would remain Chinese territory, a tiny enclave surrounded entirely by British-controlled land. The reasons for this exception were rooted in both symbolism and practicality. For the Qing government, maintaining some presence within sight of Hong Kong represented a matter of national dignity. The empire had already suffered the humiliation of losing Hong Kong Island and the southern tip of Kowloon. To surrender the walled city as well would have been to admit complete defeat in this corner of the empire. The British, for their part, may have calculated that this small concession would smooth negotiations while having little practical impact on their control of the region. At the time the convention was signed, the walled city's population numbered roughly 700 people. These were mostly the families of soldiers and officials, along with a small community of merchants and craftsmen who had established themselves within the walls. It was a quiet, self-contained settlement, remarkable only for its location entirely surrounded by British territory. No one could have predicted what it would become. The jurisdictional ambiguity created by the 1898 convention would prove to be the seed from which all the walled city's subsequent strangeness would grow. The British had acquired the land surrounding the walled city, but not the city itself. The Chinese had retained sovereignty over the city, but had no land connection to the rest of China. This situation might have remained a mere curiosity of international law had events unfolded differently. But the early years of the 20th century would bring upheaval that would transform the walled city from a garrisoned outpost into something unprecedented. The British colonial government in Hong Kong watched the walled city with growing suspicion. Governor Henry Blake, who served from 1898 to 1903, suspected that the Viceroy of Canton was using the garrison to organize resistance to British rule in the new territories. The handover of such a large territory had not gone smoothly. Indigenous inhabitants of the new territories had resisted British rule, and fighting had broken out in what became known as the Six-Day War of 1899. Blake believed that Chinese troops in the walled city were supporting this resistance. On April 14, 1899, British forces attacked the walled city. This was a significant escalation, a direct military assault on what was technically Chinese territory. The British soldiers found the fort largely abandoned. The Viceroy's troops had already withdrawn, leaving behind only the Mandarin administrator and approximately 150 residents. The British had captured the walled city, but the question of what to do with it remained unanswered. The British government claimed jurisdiction over the walled city following this action, arguing that the Chinese had forfeited their rights by using the garrison to foment unrest. But this claim was never formally accepted by China, and the British themselves seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The walled city existed in a legal grey zone, claimed by Britain but with that claim disputed, no longer effectively governed by China but with Chinese sovereignty never formally renounced. This uncertainty was compounded in 1912 when the Qing dynasty finally collapsed, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The new Republic of China inherited the Qing's claims to the walled city, but the young republic was too consumed with its own internal struggles to pursue the matter. Civil war and foreign invasion would dominate Chinese politics for the next 4 decades, leaving little energy for disputes over a tiny enclave in a British colony. The fall of the Qing dynasty marked the end of an era that had lasted for millennia. The emperor who had once been considered divine, the bureaucratic systems that had governed hundreds of millions of people, the traditions and rituals that had structured Chinese society, all of these were swept away in the revolutionary fervor of 1911 and 1912. The new Republic of China promised modernization and reform, but first it had to establish itself against warlords, foreign powers, and internal factions that competed for control. In this context, the question of who governed a tiny enclave in a British colony seemed almost laughably insignificant. The Republic's claims to the walled city were inherited from the dynasty it had overthrown, but those claims were more theoretical than practical. No Republican officials were appointed to administer the settlement. No Republican troops garrisoned its walls. The walled city became an orphan of history, its future undefined and its present increasingly uncertain. The British, meanwhile, did little with their claimed possession. The colonial administration had more pressing concerns than determining the status of a small settlement whose legal position remained contested. The First World War demanded attention and resources. The post-war years brought their own challenges. And so the walled city drifted, neither fully British nor fully Chinese, existing in a state of administrative limbo that would persist for decades. For several decades, the walled city existed in a state of benign neglect. The Holy Trinity Church established charitable institutions within the old Yamen building, including a home for elderly residents, a school, and an almshouse. These organizations provided services to the small community that remained within the walls, keeping alive some semblance of organized society in this administrative orphan. The charitable work of the church filled a void that would otherwise have left residents without any institutional support. The elderly who had no family to care for them found shelter in a home established within the Yamen. Children received education that prepared them for life in the wider colony, even if their home remained outside its jurisdiction. Those who fell on hard times could seek assistance from the almshouse, their dignity preserved even as their circumstances demanded charity. The church's presence also maintained a connection to the outside world that might otherwise have been severed entirely. Through religious services and community gatherings, residents remained part of something larger than their immediate circumstances. The festivals of the Christian calendar marked the passage of time alongside the traditional Chinese celebrations that residents also observed. In this small community surrounded by competing claims and legal ambiguity, the church provided a measure of stability and continuity. Aside from these charitable institutions, the walled city became something of a curiosity for British colonials and tourists. A 1915 map of Hong Kong labeled it simply as Chinese Town, acknowledging its distinct character without clarifying its legal status. The stone walls still stood, though they were beginning to show their age. The buildings within them housed a small population that lived according to customs and rhythms quite different from the bustling colony that surrounded them. In 1933, the Hong Kong government announced plans to address this anomaly by demolishing most of the decaying buildings within the walled city. By this time, approximately 436 squatters had taken up residence in the increasingly dilapidated structures. The government offered to compensate these residents with new housing elsewhere in the colony. But the plan immediately provoked protests from an unexpected quarter. The nationalist Chinese government, which had unified much of China under its rule, formally protested the demolition plans. They claimed jurisdiction over the walled city and accused the British of attempting to eliminate the last vestige of Chinese sovereignty in the area. This was not merely a matter of real estate. It was a question of national dignity, of whether China would allow yet another piece of its territory to be absorbed into a foreign colony. The dispute continued throughout the mid-1930s. The nationalist government repeatedly asserted its claims over the walled city in 1935, 1936, and into 1937. The British responded with various proposals, including the possibility of turning the site into a Chinese consulate general. But these negotiations were overtaken by events far larger than any dispute over a few acres of land. In July 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. The question of who controlled the Kowloon walled city suddenly seemed very small indeed. By 1940, with war raging across China and threatening to engulf all of Asia, only a handful of structures remained standing within the walled city. The Yamen building still stood, along with the school and one private residence. The stone walls that had defined the site for nearly a century were weathered but still intact, silent witnesses to the upheaval that had transformed the region around them. Then came December 1941, and the Japanese attack on Hong Kong. The British colony fell after 18 days of fierce fighting, and for the next 3 years and 8 months, Hong Kong would be under Japanese military occupation. This occupation would have profound consequences for the walled city, though not in ways that anyone could have anticipated. The Japanese invasion of Hong Kong began on December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor had announced Japan's entry into the Pacific War. The British garrison, vastly outnumbered and inadequately prepared, fought desperately to defend the colony. Fighting raged across the new territories, then the Kowloon Peninsula, and finally Hong Kong Island itself. The resistance was fierce but ultimately futile. On Christmas Day, 1941, the British governor surrendered to Japanese forces, beginning an occupation that would last until Japan's defeat in August 1945. For the residents of Hong Kong, including those in the walled city, the occupation brought years of hardship, scarcity, and fear. The Japanese military government imposed strict controls on food distribution, resulting in widespread hunger and malnutrition. The economy collapsed as trade ceased and businesses closed. Those suspected of resistance or disloyalty faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. The population of Hong Kong fell dramatically as residents fled to mainland China or died from starvation and disease. The walled city's ambiguous status offered no protection during this period. To the Japanese occupiers, the legal disputes between Britain and China were irrelevant. The settlement was simply part of the territory they had conquered, to be administered as they saw fit. Whatever residents had hoped their enclave's special status might provide was swept away by the realities of military occupation. The Japanese military needed construction materials for their ambitious projects in the occupied territory, particularly for the expansion of Kai Tak Airport. This airfield, located just a few hundred meters south of the walled city, was being upgraded to handle larger aircraft and higher traffic volumes. The Japanese looked at the ancient stone walls of the Kowloon fortress and saw not historical heritage but building materials. The expansion of Kai Tak was strategically vital to the Japanese war effort. The airfield was intended to serve as a major hub for military aviation, supporting operations across southern China and Southeast Asia. The existing runway was too short and too narrow to accommodate the larger aircraft that Japan was deploying. Expansion was essential, and the Japanese military was not inclined to let historical considerations stand in the way. Between 1943 and 1945, Japanese forces systematically demolished the historic walls that had given the walled city its name. Stone by stone, the fortifications that Qing workers had labored to build nearly a century earlier were torn down and carted away. The stones were used in the construction of the expanded Kai Tak runway, their history literally buried beneath the concrete and asphalt of the new airfield. In their search for materials, the Japanese also destroyed the Sun Wong Toi, a large rock memorial commemorating the last emperor of the Song dynasty, who had fled to this area before his dynasty's final defeat. The destruction of the walls was more than just the loss of physical structures. It severed the connection to the site's original purpose as a fortification, erasing the visible link to the centuries of Chinese military presence that had defined the settlement's character. The walls had been the walled city's most distinctive feature, the element that set it apart from the surrounding territory and gave it its name. Without them, the site became something else entirely, a blank slate on which a new and very different kind of settlement would be written. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the walled city existed only as a name. The walls were gone, replaced by a vacant lot scattered with rubble and the few remaining structures. The yamen still stood, battered but intact. The school and a handful of other buildings had survived the occupation. But the defining feature of the site, the walls that had enclosed it for nearly a century, had been reduced to rubble and runway. The post-war period brought new upheaval to China and new complications for the walled city. In November 1946, nationalist Chinese officials announced their intention to reclaim the site. They created a draft outline plan for reinstatement of administration that envisioned rebuilding Chinese government presence in the enclave, complete with offices, schools, police, and other administrative functions. The walled city, in their vision, would once again become a functioning outpost of Chinese authority. But events were moving faster than anyone could plan. The Chinese Civil War, which had been interrupted by the Japanese invasion, resumed with devastating intensity. The nationalist government found itself fighting for survival against communist forces that were gaining ground across the country. Millions of Chinese refugees began fleeing southward, seeking safety from the advancing armies and the chaos of civil war. Many of these refugees ended up in Hong Kong. The British colony, which had been battered by war and occupation, suddenly found itself overwhelmed by waves of displaced persons seeking shelter. Housing was scarce, jobs were few, and the colonial government struggled to manage the influx. Among the places where refugees sought shelter was the former walled city, now an open site with a handful of standing buildings and the legal ambiguity that made it attractive to those who wanted to avoid the scrutiny of either British or Chinese authorities. The scale of the refugee crisis was staggering. Between 1945 and 1950, the population of Hong Kong more than tripled, swelling from around 600,000 to nearly 2 million. These were not voluntary immigrants seeking opportunity but desperate people fleeing violence, persecution, and the collapse of everything they had known. They arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs, having lost homes, businesses, and often family members to the war that was consuming mainland China. The British colonial government, already stretched thin by the war and occupation, lacked the resources to accommodate this massive influx. Housing construction could not keep pace with demand. Squatter settlements sprouted across the colony, as refugees built shelters wherever they could find space. Hillsides, rooftops, and vacant lots were transformed into impromptu communities that housed tens of thousands of people in conditions of desperate poverty. The walled city was particularly attractive to refugees for several reasons. Its undefined legal status meant that neither British nor Chinese authorities exercised clear control over the site. Residents could settle there without worrying about permits, registrations, or the other bureaucratic requirements that applied elsewhere in the colony. Those who had reason to avoid official attention, whether because of political associations, criminal records, or simply the inability to produce proper documentation, found the walled city's ambiguity particularly welcoming. By 1947, approximately 2,000 squatters had established themselves on the site. They erected makeshift shelters from whatever materials they could find, creating a shanty town amid the ruins of the ancient fort. The British colonial government, already overwhelmed by the refugee crisis, attempted to assert control. In 1948, police moved in to clear the squatters. But this action provoked another round of diplomatic protests from the nationalist Chinese government. The clearance attempt highlighted the ongoing uncertainty about who actually governed the walled city. The British claimed authority by virtue of their control of the surrounding territory. The nationalist Chinese government, fighting for survival on the mainland, nevertheless found time to assert sovereignty over this small enclave within the British colony. The dispute was both absurd and deadly serious, touching on questions of national dignity that neither side was willing to compromise. On January 8, 1948, the nationalist government sent a formal memorandum to the British ambassador, asserting unequivocally that China retained jurisdiction over the walled city and had no intention of renouncing that claim. The British Foreign Office, faced with this clear statement of Chinese position, considered various solutions. Some officials suggested that Britain should simply accept Chinese jurisdiction over the site while obtaining Chinese agreement not to actually exercise that jurisdiction. Others proposed turning the site into a public park controlled by Hong Kong's municipal authorities. The arguments within the British government revealed the complexity of the situation. Some officials worried that accepting Chinese jurisdiction would establish a precedent that could complicate Britain's position elsewhere in the empire. Others argued that the practical realities on the ground made the legal question largely irrelevant. The squatters were there, the walled city was developing according to its own logic, and any attempt to impose order would require resources that might be better spent elsewhere. The diplomatic back and forth continued through 1948 and into 1949, but by then it had become academic. In October 1949, the Communist forces declared victory and established the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan, where it continued to claim sovereignty over all of China, including the Kowloon walled city. Now there were three parties with potential claims to the site: the British, who actually surrounded it, the Communists in Beijing, who now controlled mainland China, and the nationalists in Taipei, who claimed to be the legitimate government of all China. The British colonial government, faced with this impossibly complex situation, adopted what would prove to be a fateful policy. They would take a hands-off approach to the walled city, neither asserting full control nor allowing either Chinese government to establish authority there. The site would exist in a kind of administrative limbo, governed by no one in particular, subject to no building codes, health regulations, or tax collection. This policy was born partly of diplomatic caution. The British did not want to provoke either Chinese government by taking decisive action on such a symbolically charged issue. It was also born of practical considerations. The walled city was small, isolated, and full of desperately poor refugees. Bringing it under full colonial administration would require resources that were needed elsewhere. And so the decision was made, or perhaps more accurately, the decision was avoided, to simply let the walled city develop as it would. In January 1950, a devastating fire swept through the walled city. The blaze destroyed over 2,500 makeshift huts, leaving nearly 3,500 families and approximately 17,000 people homeless. The fire highlighted the desperate conditions in the settlement and the complete lack of fire safety infrastructure. But it also created an opportunity. The ruins gave new arrivals the chance to build anew, and speculation arose that the fire might have been deliberately set to clear space for new construction. The fire revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of the walled city community. Within hours, thousands of people had lost everything they possessed. The makeshift shelters that had provided whatever comfort they offered were reduced to ashes. Families who had fled the chaos of civil war now found themselves homeless again, their meager possessions consumed by flames. But the response to the disaster demonstrated the determination that would characterize the walled city throughout its existence. Even before the ashes had cooled, survivors began rebuilding. Neighboring communities provided assistance. Religious organizations distributed food and supplies. And within weeks, new structures were rising from the ruins, more substantial than what had been lost, as residents resolved to build something that would better withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. The causes of the fire were never definitively established. Some believed it had started accidentally, the inevitable result of cooking fires and improvised heating in densely packed wooden structures. Others suspected arson, theorizing that someone with an interest in redevelopment had deliberately cleared the site. The truth may never be known, but the consequences were clear. The walled city that emerged from the ashes would be very different from the settlement that had existed before. The disaster did nothing to slow the influx of new residents. If anything, the walled city's population grew faster in the years following the fire. The absence of government regulation meant that anyone could build anything, anywhere within the site's boundaries. Rents were low because landlords paid no taxes. Businesses could operate without licenses. Workers needed no permits. For the desperate refugees streaming into Hong Kong, the walled city offered something precious, a place where they could survive without navigating the bureaucracy of the colonial government. The appeal was particularly strong for those who had reasons to avoid official attention. Some were political refugees whose associations with the defeated nationalist government made them unwelcome in the new People's Republic. Others were individuals with criminal backgrounds who found the walled city's absence of police presence convenient. Still others were simply poor people who lacked the documentation required to access public housing or formal employment. For all of these, the walled city offered a refuge where questions were rarely asked and paperwork was largely unnecessary. The character of the settlement began to shift. The makeshift huts of the immediate post-war period gave way to more substantial structures. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity in this unregulated space. Doctors and dentists who lacked proper credentials or licenses could practice freely within the walled city's boundaries. Factories that would have faced inspection and regulation elsewhere could operate without interference. And less savory businesses found the absence of police presence equally attractive. By the early 1950s, the walled city had begun its transformation into something unique in the modern world. It was not a slum in the traditional sense, though it was certainly poor. It was not a planned settlement, though it was developing its own internal logic. It was not quite lawless, though it existed outside the law of any recognized government. It was becoming something new, an accidental experiment in what happens when a dense urban population is left entirely to its own devices. The triads moved in during this period. These Chinese organized crime syndicates had existed for centuries, originally as secret societies opposed to foreign domination of China. By the mid-20th century, they had evolved into sophisticated criminal organizations involved in gambling, prostitution, drug trafficking, and extortion. The walled city, with its absence of police presence and its desperate population, was perfect territory for their operations. The 14K and Sun Yee-on were among the most powerful triad organizations to establish themselves in the walled city. The 14K had been formed in 1945 by a nationalist Chinese general as an anti-communist organization. After the communist victory in 1949, many of its members fled to Hong Kong, where they evolved from political activists into criminals. The Sun Yee-on, one of the largest triads in Hong Kong, saw the walled city as valuable territory for their operations. The history of the 14K illustrated the complicated relationship between politics and organized crime in mid-20th century China. The organization had been founded by Lieutenant General Kot Su-won as part of the Kuomintang's efforts to combat communist influence. Its original members were soldiers and officials loyal to the nationalist cause, and its activities were directed toward political rather than criminal ends. But the communist victory changed everything. When the nationalists retreated to Taiwan in 1949, many 14K members found themselves stranded in Hong Kong. Cut off from their leadership and their political purpose, they gradually redirected their organizational skills toward criminal enterprises. The discipline and hierarchy that had served political ends now facilitated drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion. The 14K transformed from a political organization into a criminal syndicate, one of the most powerful in Hong Kong. By the mid-1950s, the 14K had established themselves as a major force within the walled city. Their operations included protection rackets that extracted payments from businesses and residents, gambling operations that ran around the clock, and drug distribution networks that funneled heroin and opium from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle. Their presence was both profitable and violent, enforced through intimidation and, when necessary, brutal physical punishment. The Sun Yee-on brought similar capabilities to the walled city, though their organization had different origins. Founded in the 1910s, the Sun Yee-on had evolved over decades into one of Hong Kong's largest and most sophisticated criminal organizations. By some estimates, their membership exceeded 50,000, with operations spanning gambling, prostitution, drug trafficking, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. These organizations carved up the walled city into territories, each controlling specific streets or buildings. They ran gambling parlors where workers could lose their meager wages at mahjong or dice. They operated opium dens where the desperate could escape their troubles in narcotic haze. They controlled brothels where women, often trafficked from mainland China, serviced clients in tiny rooms. And they enforced their control through violence, intimidation, and the simple absence of any alternative authority. The gambling operations were among the most visible of the triad enterprises. Small rooms throughout the walled city were converted into gambling dens where residents and visitors alike could wager on mahjong, card games, or dice. The games ran continuously, day and night, extracting money from workers who could ill afford to lose it. The triads ensured that gambling debts were paid, using methods that ranged from verbal threats to physical violence against those who defaulted. The drug trade was perhaps the most profitable and most destructive of the triad businesses. Heroin and opium flowed into the walled city through networks that connected to producers in Thailand, Burma, and Laos. The settlement's absence of police presence made it an ideal distribution point, and addiction rates among residents were devastatingly high. The opium dens that operated openly offered escape from the grinding poverty that defined life for many walled city residents, but they also trapped users in cycles of dependency that destroyed lives and families. Prostitution flourished under triad control, with brothels operating throughout the settlement. Many of the women who worked in these establishments had been trafficked from mainland China, lured by promises of legitimate employment only to find themselves trapped in sexual servitude. Others had turned to prostitution out of desperation, finding no other way to survive in the harsh economic environment of post-war Hong Kong. The triads profited from their labor while providing nothing resembling protection or support. The Hong Kong police, who were supposed to maintain order throughout the colony, found the walled city essentially impenetrable. The narrow alleys and interconnected buildings created a maze that favored those who knew its passages. Residents, even those not involved in criminal activity, had learned not to cooperate with outside authorities. The triads had eyes everywhere and long memories. Anyone who helped the police could expect retaliation. For many years, police would only enter the walled city in large groups, and even then only for specific operations targeting particular individuals or establishments. Routine patrols were impossible. The normal mechanisms of law enforcement simply did not apply within those densely packed blocks. A murder committed in the walled city might never be solved, not because the killer could not be identified, but because no witness would dare speak to investigators. It was during a murder trial in 1959 that the legal status of the walled city was finally clarified, at least in the eyes of Hong Kong law. A killing had occurred within the settlement, and the defendant argued that Hong Kong courts had no jurisdiction because the crime had been committed on Chinese territory. The court rejected this argument, ruling that Hong Kong did indeed have legal authority over the walled city. But by then, the ruling was largely symbolic. The triads controlled the streets, and no court decision was going to change that reality. The decade following this ruling saw the walled city's criminal enterprises reach their peak. The opium trade flourished, with product flowing in from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle through networks established by the 14K and their allies. The gambling operations ran around the clock, extracting money from workers who could ill afford to lose it. The brothels continued their grim business. And the triads grew wealthy and powerful on the proceeds. But the walled city was never simply a den of iniquity. Alongside the gambling parlors and opium dens, ordinary families were raising children, cooking meals, and building lives. The vast majority of residents had nothing to do with organized crime. They were factory workers and shopkeepers, seamstresses and cooks, elderly grandparents and school-age children. They lived in the walled city because they had nowhere else to go, because the rents were affordable, because this was where their family had established itself when they first arrived in Hong Kong. These ordinary residents developed their own mechanisms for maintaining order and resolving disputes. Neighborhood associations emerged to address common concerns. Community leaders, often respected elders or successful business people, served as informal mediators when conflicts arose. Religious institutions, including Buddhist temples and Christian churches, provided both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. The walled city was developing its own form of governance, unofficial and unrecognized, but functional in its own way. The transformation of the walled city's physical character accelerated during the 1960s. The makeshift huts and low-rise buildings of the early post-war period began to give way to taller structures. The shortage of space forced construction upward rather than outward. Developers, working entirely outside any regulatory framework, began erecting buildings of 4, 5, 6 stories and higher. Each new building was connected to its neighbors, creating an increasingly dense and interconnected mass. The construction methods were improvised and often dangerous. Without building codes, engineers, or inspections, each builder used whatever techniques and materials seemed adequate. Foundations were shallow or non-existent. Load-bearing walls were often too thin. Electrical wiring was done by amateurs. But the buildings went up anyway, floor upon floor, driven by the relentless demand for housing in this corner of Hong Kong where the normal rules did not apply. By the end of the 1960s, the walled city had begun to take on its characteristic appearance. The individual buildings had merged into a single massive structure, a block of interconnected buildings that rose 10, 12, 14 stories into the air. The streets that had once run between buildings had become covered alleyways, permanently shadowed by the structures that loomed above them. Residents could travel from one end of the settlement to the other without ever touching the ground, navigating a network of staircases, corridors, and rooftop paths. The height of the buildings was limited not by any regulation but by the proximity of Kai Tak Airport. The runway that had been extended using stones from the demolished walls now brought aircraft directly over the walled city. Planes on final approach passed just a few hundred meters above the rooftops. Any building that rose too high would pose a hazard to aviation. This practical constraint, rather than any government intervention, set the ultimate limit on how tall the walled city could grow. The noise from those aircraft became part of the rhythm of daily life. Residents grew accustomed to the thunder of jet engines passing overhead, to the brief moments when conversation became impossible, to the vibration that rattled windows and dishes. Children learned to pause their games when the planes came over, resuming their play as the sound faded into the distance. The aircraft were a constant reminder of the outside world that surrounded this strange enclave, a world of regulations and authorities that stopped at the invisible boundaries of the walled city. The early 1970s brought a turning point in the walled city's relationship with organized crime. The Hong Kong government, responding to public pressure and growing concerns about corruption, launched a sustained campaign against the triads. Between 1973 and 1974, police conducted over 3,500 raids within the walled city. These were not the tentative incursions of earlier years but determined operations backed by overwhelming force. The results were dramatic. Over 2,500 arrests were made, and more than 1,800 kilograms of drugs were seized. The opium dens and gambling parlors that had operated openly for decades were shut down or driven underground. The triads did not disappear entirely, but their control over the walled city was broken. For the first time in decades, residents could walk the streets without fear of running afoul of criminal organizations. The raids succeeded in part because of changing attitudes within the walled city itself. Younger residents, who had grown up in the settlement and aspired to something better, supported the police actions. They were tired of living in a place associated with crime and vice. They wanted their home to be seen as something other than a den of iniquity. Their cooperation, breaking the traditional code of silence, made the police operations far more effective than earlier efforts had been. By 1983, the district police commander could declare that crime in the walled city was under control. The triad still existed, but they no longer ruled. The gambling continued, but more discreetly. The drug trade had moved elsewhere. The walled city remained outside the normal framework of Hong Kong law, but it was no longer the lawless frontier it had been in the 1950s and 1960s. A new chapter in the settlement's history was beginning. The population of the walled city continued to grow throughout this period, even as the criminal element waned. By the early 1980s, estimates suggested that somewhere between 33,000 and 50,000 people lived within this 2.6-hectare plot. The precise number was impossible to determine because no government conducted censuses there, but the density was staggering by any measure. At its peak, the walled city housed approximately 1.2 million people per square kilometer, making it the most densely populated place on Earth. Think about that for a moment. 1.25 million people living in a single square kilometer. The entire population of a medium-sized city compressed into an area that a reasonably fit person could walk across in 10 minutes. Yet within this impossibly crowded space, tens of thousands of people managed to live, work, raise families, and create communities. They did so without city planners, without building inspectors, without zoning regulations, without any of the systems that modern urban dwellers take for granted. The buildings that housed this population had grown together into something that defied easy description. Approximately 350 individual structures had merged into what was essentially a single enormous building, covering almost every square meter of the site. The only open spaces were a few small courtyards and the rooftops, which served as communal areas where residents could find sunlight and relatively fresh air. The streets that had once existed at ground level had become dark corridors, their surfaces perpetually damp, sunlight a distant memory. Navigation through the walled city required knowledge that only residents possessed. The alleys twisted and turned, climbed and descended, branched and dead-ended in patterns that followed no logic discernible to outsiders. Some passages were wide enough for two people to pass, barely. Others required walking sideways, squeezing between walls that seemed to press in from either side. Signs and landmarks that made sense to residents were invisible to visitors, who could walk in circles for hours without finding their destination. The building techniques varied widely from structure to structure. Some buildings had proper reinforced concrete frames, constructed by workers who understood engineering principles. Others were held together by little more than optimism, their walls too thin, their foundations too shallow, their structural members inadequate for the loads they bore. Remarkably, no building in the walled city ever collapsed, a testament to either luck or some kind of collective engineering wisdom that emerged from the settlement's improvisational construction methods. Water was one of the most persistent challenges facing walled city residents. The Hong Kong government had eventually installed 8 communal water pipes that served the entire settlement, but these were woefully inadequate for the population they served. Water pressure was unreliable, especially on upper floors. Many buildings supplemented the municipal supply with their own wells, drilling down into the aquifer beneath the city. The water from these wells was often contaminated, contributing to health problems that plagued many residents. Electricity came to the walled city through improvised connections that would have horrified any licensed electrician. Residents tapped into the grid that served the surrounding neighborhoods, running wires through the labyrinthine passages without concern for safety codes or proper insulation. The resulting tangle of cables hung from ceilings and ran along walls, creating hazards that miraculously resulted in relatively few accidents. Power outages were common, and some residents simply learned to live by candlelight when the electricity failed. Sewage presented perhaps the greatest infrastructure challenge. The Hong Kong government never extended its sewer system into the walled city. Human waste flowed through pipes that had been installed haphazardly, without any overall plan for drainage. Much of it eventually made its way to Kowloon Bay, contributing to pollution problems that affected the entire harbor. The smell was ever present, mixing with cooking odors and industrial fumes to create an atmosphere that newcomers found overwhelming. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, a remarkable spirit of community developed within the walled city. Neighbors looked out for one another in ways that had become rare in modern urban environments. Elderly residents who could no longer navigate the stairs were brought food by younger neighbors. Parents kept an eye on each other's children. When someone fell ill, word spread quickly, and help materialized without being asked. The density that would have bred alienation in other settings somehow fostered connection. The rooftops became the social heart of the community. During daylight hours, residents could escape the perpetual dimness below and find actual sunlight on these elevated spaces. Children played games while their parents hung laundry to dry. Elderly residents practiced Tai Chi in the early morning hours. Gardens flourished in improvised planters, providing both fresh vegetables and small touches of green in this concrete world. The rooftops were where neighbors became friends, where gossip was exchanged, where the community found its common ground. Religious life thrived within the walled city despite its reputation for lawlessness. Several Buddhist and Taoist temples operated within the settlement, providing spiritual comfort and maintaining traditional festivals that marked the passage of the year. The Phuk Tak Temple, dedicated to the earth god, drew worshippers seeking blessings for their homes and businesses. Christian churches also established themselves in the walled city, most notably through the work of missionaries like Jackie Pullinger. Jackie Pullinger was a British woman who arrived in Hong Kong in 1966 at the age of 22, driven by what she believed was a divine calling to serve the poor. She found her way to the walled city and decided to stay, establishing a youth club and eventually a ministry focused on helping drug addicts recover from their dependencies. Her approach combined Christian faith with practical assistance, and over the decades she helped hundreds of residents overcome their addictions and rebuild their lives. Pullinger's work brought international attention to the walled city and complicated the narrative of utter lawlessness that had defined external perceptions. Here was a place where organized crime had flourished and yet where genuine community also existed. Here was a settlement beyond the reach of law and yet where faith and charity found expression. The walled city defied easy categorization, containing multitudes within its densely packed blocks. The economy of the walled city was as improvised as its architecture. Small factories operated in virtually every corner of the settlement, producing everything from noodles to fish balls to plastic flowers. These enterprises took advantage of the absence of safety inspections, minimum wage laws, and environmental regulations. Working conditions were often harsh, with employees laboring long hours in poorly ventilated spaces. But the factories provided employment for residents who might have found it difficult to secure work in the regulated economy outside. Food production was one of the most significant industries. The tight corridors were lined with small kitchens producing dim sum, roast meats, and other prepared foods that were sold both within the walled city and in shops throughout Hong Kong. The lack of health inspections troubled some outside observers, but the food was cheap and generally safe, produced by workers who had learned their trades through years of experience rather than formal certification. The medical and dental professions occupied a peculiar niche in the walled city economy. Practitioners who could not obtain licenses in Hong Kong, either because they lacked proper qualifications or because their credentials were not recognized, found they could practice freely within the settlement's boundaries. This meant that residents had access to affordable medical care that might otherwise have been beyond their means. It also meant that the quality of care varied enormously, from genuinely skilled practitioners to outright charlatans. Dentists were particularly numerous in the walled city, their offices clustered along certain corridors. Some had trained in mainland China before the communist takeover and held legitimate qualifications that Hong Kong did not recognize. Others had learned their skills through apprenticeship or had simply decided that dentistry was a profession they could practice without formal training. Patients took their chances, but for many, an unlicensed walled city dentist was better than no dental care at all. As the 1980s progressed, the future of the walled city became an increasingly pressing question. Hong Kong itself was approaching a momentous change. The 99-year lease that had given Britain control of the new territories was set to expire in 1997, and negotiations between British and Chinese officials were determining what would happen when that date arrived. The Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 established that Hong Kong, including the new territories, would be returned to Chinese sovereignty. This agreement resolved the larger question of Hong Kong's future but left the specific fate of the walled city uncertain. The settlement had been explicitly excluded from the original 1898 lease, so technically its status should not have been affected by the lease's expiration. But everyone understood that the walled city's days were numbered. The Chinese government had no more interest in preserving this anomalous settlement than the British did. Both sides saw it as an embarrassment, a reminder of colonial-era conflicts that they preferred to forget. On January 14, 1987, the Hong Kong government announced that the walled city would be demolished. This was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. What remained to be determined was how the demolition would proceed, what compensation would be offered to residents and businesses, and what would replace the settlement once it was gone. These questions would take years to resolve, and the resolution would not always be peaceful. The announcement triggered mixed emotions within the walled city. Some residents welcomed the prospect of relocation to modern housing with proper plumbing, reliable electricity, and adequate space. They had lived in difficult conditions not by choice but by necessity, and they were ready for something better. Others were more ambivalent, attached to the community they had built and skeptical of promises from a government that had ignored them for decades. The compensation negotiations were contentious. The government initially offered amounts that many residents considered inadequate, particularly given the sky-high property values in Hong Kong. Landlords who had built and maintained buildings for decades demanded fair value for their investments. Tenants who had lived in the walled city for years wanted assurance that they would be able to afford housing elsewhere. Business owners faced the loss of their livelihoods and sought compensation accordingly. The total cost of compensation would eventually reach approximately 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars, reflecting the complexity of ownership claims within the walled city. In a settlement where building codes had never existed, where property boundaries were often unclear, and where documentation was frequently lacking, determining who owned what and what that ownership was worth required negotiations that dragged on for years. Evictions began in November 1991 and continued until July 1992. Most residents left peacefully, accepting their compensation and relocating to public housing estates scattered across Hong Kong. But some refused to go, either because they felt the compensation was insufficient or because they simply could not imagine living anywhere else. police eventually removed the last holdouts, ending a human presence on the site that had continued, in one form or another, for centuries. Demolition began on March 23, 1993. Construction crews moved in with their heavy equipment, and the work of dismantling the walled city began. Building by building, floor by floor, the massive structure was taken apart. The process would continue for over a year, finally concluding in April 1994. Where the most densely populated place on Earth had stood, there was now only a cleared site awaiting transformation. The Hong Kong government converted the site into a public park, deliberately invoking the history of the location while creating something entirely new. Kowloon Walled City Park opened on December 22, 1995, incorporating elements that acknowledged the site's past while serving contemporary needs for green space in this densely developed district. The design followed the Jiangnan garden style of the early Qing dynasty, connecting the park to the period when the original fortification had been built. Within the park, visitors could still find traces of the walled city's long history. Remnants of the South Gate, one of the original entrances to the Qing-era fort, had been preserved and incorporated into the park design. A portion of the original stone wall foundations was excavated and left exposed, allowing visitors to appreciate the scale of the fortification that had once stood there. The Yamen building, which had survived the Japanese occupation and decades of informal development, was restored and turned into a museum exhibit. But the most remarkable aspects of the walled city were gone forever. The labyrinthine corridors and impossible density, the rooftop communities and improvised infrastructure, the factories and clinics and temples that had occupied every available space, these existed now only in photographs and memories. An entire world had been erased, its former residents scattered across Hong Kong and beyond. The legacy of the walled city lived on in the minds of those who had experienced it. Former residents sometimes gathered for reunions, sharing memories of a place that seemed increasingly unreal as years passed. Authors wrote books attempting to capture what life had been like within those walls that no longer existed. Documentary filmmakers sought out elderly former residents, recording their testimonies before they were lost to time. The walled city became a subject of intense interest precisely because it no longer existed. Photographers who had documented the settlement before its demolition found their work in demand from architects, urban planners, and sociologists fascinated by this unplanned experiment in human habitation. The images revealed a complexity that defied the simplistic narratives of lawlessness and squalor that had dominated outside perceptions. Here were families gathered for meals in tiny apartments. Here were children doing homework under flickering fluorescent lights. Here were elderly residents tending rooftop gardens with patient care. The walled city had been many things, but it had above all been a home. The resonance of the walled city extended into popular culture in unexpected ways. Video game designers found inspiration in its dense verticality and chaotic aesthetic. The survival horror game Kowloon's Gate, released in 1997, recreated the settlement's atmosphere for players who had never experienced the real thing. The fighting game franchise Shenmue included detailed recreations of the walled city, while the anime Ghost in the Shell imagined a cyberpunk future that owed much to the settlement's organic urban density. Hollywood discovered the walled city as well, using it as a setting for action sequences and as a visual reference for dystopian futures. Jean-Claude Van Damme's Bloodsport and Jackie Chan's Crime Story were among the films that featured scenes shot in or inspired by the settlement. The distinctive aesthetic of the walled city, all narrow alleys and looming buildings and tangled infrastructure, became a kind of visual shorthand for urban decay and lawless territory. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the walled city was the questions it raised about how humans live together. Here was a settlement that had violated every principle of modern urban planning and yet had functioned for decades. Here was a place without government regulation where tens of thousands of people had nevertheless managed to coexist. Here was a community that outsiders had dismissed as a slum but that residents had considered home. These questions have only become more pressing as the world has urbanized. More than half of humanity now lives in cities, and that proportion continues to grow. The formal mechanisms of urban planning struggle to keep pace with this growth, particularly in the developing world where informal settlements house millions of people in conditions that echo, in some ways, the walled city's improvisational character. What lessons might be drawn from a place that defied all the rules and yet somehow worked? The answers are not simple. The walled city's density was only possible because it was surrounded by a well-governed city that provided many of the services its residents needed. The infrastructure that kept the settlement functioning was improvised, unreliable, and often dangerous. The absence of building codes meant that residents lived in structures that could have collapsed at any moment. For all the community spirit that developed within its walls, the walled city was also home to exploitation, disease, and suffering that proper governance might have prevented. Yet there was something in the walled city that modern planned developments often lack. The organic nature of its growth created spaces that served the actual needs of residents rather than the abstract visions of planners. The mixing of residential, commercial, and industrial uses that would horrify modern zoning authorities actually made life more convenient for residents who could live, work, and shop within the same building. The informal economy provided opportunities for people who might have been excluded from the formal job market. The architecture of the Kowloon walled city defied every principle that urban planners hold dear, yet it possessed a strange logic of its own that emerged from decades of improvised construction. Each building had been erected by a different owner, using different techniques, at different times, with different materials. Yet somehow these individual structures had merged into a coherent whole, a single massive organism that sprawled across its 2.6 hectares like nothing else on Earth. When you look at photographs of the walled city taken in its final years, the settlement appears almost organic, like a coral reef or a termite mound, something grown rather than built. This impression was not accidental but reflected the reality of how the settlement developed. There was no master plan, no zoning committee, no architectural review board. Each building arose from the decisions of individual owners responding to their immediate circumstances, yet the collective result possessed a coherence that professional planners might have envied. The density that resulted from this organic growth was simply staggering. Consider that at its peak, the walled city housed approximately 33,000 people within 2.6 hectares. That translates to roughly 1.27 million people per square kilometer, a figure that exceeds any other recorded human settlement. To put this in perspective, Manhattan at its most crowded areas houses approximately 27,000 people per square kilometer. The walled city was nearly 50 times more dense than one of the most famously crowded places on Earth. To understand how this happened, imagine a plot of land where anyone can build anything without seeking permission from any authority. The first structures would be modest, perhaps 1 or 2 stories, constructed from whatever materials were available. As the population grew and space became precious, owners would add additional floors to their buildings. They would extend outward as well, cantilevering rooms over the narrow streets until the buildings on opposite sides of the street almost touched. The process of vertical expansion was constrained only by the physical limitations of the structures themselves and the proximity of Kai Tak Airport. Owners who wanted to add floors to their buildings simply did so, hiring workers or doing the construction themselves. There was no permit process, no engineering review, no inspection of completed work. If the building stood, the addition was successful. If it collapsed, well, that was the risk of building without proper oversight. At some point, those buildings would actually touch. A corridor might be built connecting 2 structures. An upper floor might extend far enough to rest on the building across the alley. Staircases would link buildings that had no ground-level connection. Gradually, the separate structures would merge into something larger, sharing walls and floors and rooftops in ways that made it impossible to say where one building ended and another began. The result was a three-dimensional maze of interconnected spaces that defied easy navigation. Residents could travel from one end of the settlement to the other without ever touching the ground, moving through corridors, up staircases, across rooftops, and through passages that connected building to building. A visitor who entered the walled city without a guide could easily become lost, wandering through passages that seemed to lead nowhere, climbing stairs that ended at locked doors, finding themselves back where they had started after what felt like miles of walking. This process was guided not by architects or engineers but by the practical needs of residents and the constraints of the site. The most important constraint was space itself. The walled city covered just over 26,000 square meters, roughly the size of 2.5 football pitches. Within this area, as many as 50,000 people needed to live, work, and conduct their daily business. Every square meter was precious, and construction techniques evolved to maximize the use of available space. The scarcity of horizontal space drove innovation in vertical organization. A single building might contain residential apartments on its upper floors, commercial enterprises at ground level, and small factories in between. The mixing of uses that modern zoning regulations work so hard to prevent happened naturally in the walled city, creating a pattern of living that was in some ways more convenient than what contemporary planned developments achieve. The other critical constraint was the proximity of Kai Tak Airport. The airport's single runway pointed almost directly at the walled city, requiring aircraft on final approach to pass within a few hundred meters of the settlement. Aviation regulations established height limits for any structures in the flight path, and while the walled city did not formally recognize any regulations, the practical reality of jet aircraft thundering overhead imposed its own limit. The relationship between the walled city and Kai Tak Airport was one of the settlement's most distinctive features. Aircraft on their final approach to the runway would pass directly over the rooftops, so close that residents could see the faces of passengers looking out the windows. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunder that interrupted conversations and rattled dishes in cupboards. The vibration could be felt throughout the building, a reminder of the massive machines passing just overhead. This proximity had originally been created by the Japanese during their occupation of Hong Kong, when they had demolished the walls of the old fort and used the stones to extend the Kai Tak runway. The irony was not lost on residents. The destruction of their settlement's original defining feature had created the conditions that would later limit its vertical growth. The walls that had once protected the settlement had been transformed into the runway that now constrained it. The tallest buildings in the walled city rose to approximately 14 stories, though most reached only 10 or 12. Beyond this height, the danger from passing aircraft became too great to ignore. The buildings that did reach maximum height clustered toward the center of the site, where they were slightly further from the flight path. Buildings along the edges tended to be lower, creating a profile that roughly followed the angle of aircraft descent. This natural limitation created an unusual skyline that was instantly recognizable from outside. The walled city rose like a stepped pyramid from the surrounding neighborhood, its tallest buildings at the center and progressively lower structures toward the edges. This shape was not designed but emerged from the practical constraints of the site, another example of how the settlement's organic development produced results that could seem almost intentional. The construction methods employed in the walled city ranged from surprisingly sophisticated to dangerously inadequate. Some buildings used proper reinforced concrete frames, with foundations that extended down to stable soil and structural members properly sized for their loads. These were typically the work of builders who had received formal training before arriving in Hong Kong, whether in mainland China or elsewhere. Other structures relied on construction techniques that would make any engineer wince. Foundations were sometimes little more than shallow concrete pads resting on fill and rubble. Walls that bore the weight of multiple floors above were built from thin concrete blocks with insufficient reinforcement. Extensions and additions were attached to existing structures without proper consideration of how the combined assembly would behave under load. The remarkable thing was that no building in the walled city ever collapsed. Through decades of construction and modification, through typhoons that battered Hong Kong with devastating winds and rains, through the constant vibration of aircraft passing overhead, the structures held together. Some attributed this to luck. Others suggested that the very interconnectedness of the buildings provided a kind of collective stability, each structure supporting and being supported by its neighbors. The typhoons that strike Hong Kong are among the most powerful storms on Earth, bringing winds that can exceed 200 kilometers per hour and rains that dump hundreds of millimeters of water in a matter of hours. These storms have destroyed buildings throughout the region, toppled construction cranes, and caused widespread devastation. Yet the walled city, with its improvised construction and non-existent safety standards, weathered these storms year after year. The explanation may lie partly in the very density that defined the settlement. The buildings were so closely packed that they formed a single mass, unable to sway independently in the wind as freestanding structures might. The forces that would have toppled individual buildings were distributed across the entire structure, each building supporting and being supported by its neighbors. The settlement behaved less like a collection of buildings than like a single enormous structure, and that structural unity may have provided resilience that individual buildings would have lacked. The interconnected nature of the buildings also meant that problems in one area could spread rapidly to others. A fire that broke out anywhere in the walled city had the potential to spread through the entire settlement, leaping from building to building through the connecting passages and shared walls. A collapse, had it occurred, might have triggered a chain reaction as the weight redistributed among the remaining structures. The very interconnectedness that provided stability against external forces also created vulnerabilities to internal disasters. The materials used in construction reflected the practical constraints facing walled city builders. Concrete was the primary structural material, mixed and poured in small batches as needed. Steel reinforcing bar was used where builders understood its importance, though its absence in some structures was a cause for concern among the few engineers who examined the buildings. Bricks and concrete blocks filled walls and partitions, while timber, increasingly rare as forests around Hong Kong were depleted, was used sparingly for trim and finishes. The quality of the concrete varied enormously depending on who had mixed it and under what conditions. Properly made concrete requires careful attention to the ratio of cement, sand, aggregate, and water, as well as adequate curing time before the structure is loaded. In the walled city, where construction often proceeded as quickly as materials could be obtained, these standards were not always observed. Some concrete was weaker than it should have been, more likely to crack and crumble over time. Other batches, made by workers who understood the importance of proper mixing, were as strong as anything produced by licensed contractors. The rooftops of the walled city formed a landscape unto themselves, an elevated terrain that bore little resemblance to the ground far below. At street level, the settlement was a maze of dark corridors, but above, the rooftops offered open space, sunlight, and views of the surrounding city. Residents claimed this space for a variety of purposes, transforming what might otherwise have been wasted area into an essential part of the community. The rooftop landscape was as varied as the buildings below it. Some areas were flat and open, used for drying laundry or growing vegetables. Others were cluttered with water tanks, air conditioning units, and antenna arrays. Still others had been built up with small structures, shacks, and lean-tos that provided additional living space for families who could not afford apartments below. The rooftops were contested territory, with different residents claiming different areas based on proximity, tradition, or simple assertion of possession. Television antennas sprouted from every surface, their tangled wires connecting residents to the outside world through the flickering images on their screens. Water tanks stored the pressure supply that flowed intermittently through the municipal pipes, providing a buffer against the frequent interruptions in service. Air conditioning units hummed and dripped, their condensation adding to the moisture that perpetually dampened the lower levels. Gardens flourished on the rooftops, their green leaves providing color in an otherwise gray landscape. Residents cultivated vegetables in improvised planters, growing bok choy and Chinese broccoli and other greens that supplemented their diets and reduced their food costs. Some kept small flocks of pigeons, both as pets and as a source of meat for special occasions. The rooftops were where nature found its foothold in this most unnatural of environments. Children treated the rooftops as playgrounds, running and climbing and exploring spaces that would have terrified their counterparts in the planned estates outside. Parents would call up to them from windows several floors below, their voices competing with the roar of passing aircraft. The children learned to navigate this elevated terrain with the same confidence that other children develop on flat ground, unconsciously calculating distances and assessing risks as they moved from building to building. The elderly found the rooftops welcoming as well, particularly in the early morning hours. Tai Chi practitioners would gather as the sun rose, moving through the ancient forms with meditative grace while the city around them woke to another day. Their exercises were interrupted at regular intervals by aircraft approaching Kai Tak, the peaceful movements pausing while the mechanical thunder passed overhead, then resuming as though nothing had happened. Descending from the rooftops into the interior of the walled city was like entering a different world. The narrow passages that served as streets were perpetually dim, lit only by bare fluorescent tubes that cast an unflattering glow over the damp concrete walls. The sky was visible only as a thin strip far above, framed by the buildings that pressed in from either side. For residents of the lower floors, direct sunlight was something experienced only when they ventured outside the settlement's boundaries. The streets, if they could be called that, had evolved organically over decades of development. Some followed the paths that had existed since the settlement's earliest days, maintaining their original width only because the buildings constructed alongside them respected these traditional routes. Others had been gradually narrowed as structures expanded, the walls creeping closer together until only a single person could pass at a time. At the narrowest points, residents could touch both walls simply by extending their arms. They learned to navigate these passages by feel as much as sight, their bodies automatically adjusting to the constraints of the space. Carrying large objects through these corridors required careful planning, with furniture often being lifted over buildings rather than moved through them. Moving day in the walled city was an exercise in creative problem-solving that would have baffled movers accustomed to normal urban environments. The ground level of the walled city was the wettest and darkest part of the settlement. Water seeped down from above, condensation and leakage and runoff from the rooftops finding its way through countless pathways to the bottom. The floors were perpetually damp, sometimes covered with standing water that residents navigated in rubber boots or simply bare feet. Drains clogged frequently, and the absence of any coordinated drainage system meant that problems in one area could quickly spread to others. The smell at ground level was a complex mixture that newcomers found overwhelming. Cooking odors from countless kitchens mingled with the sharp scent of disinfectant used in futile attempts to combat the perpetual dampness. Beneath these relatively pleasant smells lurked the ever-present odor of inadequate sewage disposal, a reminder that tens of thousands of people produced waste that had nowhere proper to go. Residents became accustomed to these smells, barely noticing what would have driven visitors to distraction. Despite these challenging conditions, the ground level hosted some of the walled city's most important functions. Many of the factories and workshops that provided employment for residents operated at street level, where heavy equipment could be installed without concern for the weight limits that constrained upper floors. The food producers who supplied both the walled city and businesses outside found ground floor locations convenient for receiving deliveries and shipping out their products. The medical and dental clinics that served the community also clustered at ground level, their signs advertising services in Chinese characters that promised treatment for everything from toothaches to chronic diseases. Patients waited in tiny reception areas, sitting on plastic chairs while the sounds of drills and the smell of antiseptic drifted from examination rooms barely larger than closets. The quality of care varied enormously, but for residents who could not afford Hong Kong's expensive private healthcare and did not qualify for public services, these unlicensed practitioners provided essential medical attention. Life in the walled city followed rhythms that had developed over decades of communal existence. Morning began early, with the sounds of cooking and commerce drifting through the corridors while the sky was still dark. By 6 o'clock, the streets were filled with residents heading to work, whether in the factories within the settlement or in jobs elsewhere in Hong Kong. The rooftops came alive with exercises and laundry, the day's routines beginning under the watchful passage of aircraft. The middle of the day brought a lull in activity, with many businesses closing for a few hours while their proprietors rested. The heat of the Hong Kong summer made the poorly ventilated interior of the walled city particularly uncomfortable during these hours, and those who could retreated to cooler spots to wait out the worst of it. Street vendors selling cold drinks and frozen treats did brisk business, their cries echoing through corridors where the heat seemed to have settled like a physical weight. Evening brought the walled city back to life. Families gathered for dinner in apartments that seemed impossibly cramped by outside standards but that residents had learned to use with remarkable efficiency. Children did homework at tables that also served for meals and for the piecework that many families took on to supplement their incomes. Television sets flickered in the dimness, their programs providing both entertainment and a connection to the world beyond the settlement's boundaries. The social relationships within the walled city were shaped by its unique circumstances. Neighbors were not merely people who lived nearby but essential partners in the constant work of maintaining the settlement. When the water supply failed, as it frequently did, neighbors shared what they had stored and worked together to solve the problem. When a child needed watching, any adult in the corridor could be trusted to keep an eye out. When illness struck, neighbors brought food and helped with chores until the patient recovered. This mutual dependence fostered a sense of community that many former residents recalled with genuine affection long after they had moved away. The walled city was not a comfortable place to live by any conventional measure, but it was a place where people knew each other, looked out for each other, and worked together to solve problems that would have been impossible for individuals to address alone. The absence of government services forced residents to create their own support networks, and those networks proved remarkably effective. Religious practice played an important role in the community's social fabric. The temples within the walled city served not only as places of worship but as community centers where residents gathered for festivals and celebrations. The Phuk Tak Temple, dedicated to the earth god who protected homes and businesses, was particularly important. Residents would visit to pray for prosperity, to give thanks for good fortune, or simply to find a moment of peace in this most crowded of environments. The traditional Chinese festivals punctuated the year with celebrations that brought the community together. Chinese New Year transformed the walled city, with red decorations appearing in every corridor and the sound of firecrackers echoing through the passages despite the obvious fire risk. The Mid-Autumn Festival saw families gathering on rooftops to gaze at the moon while eating mooncakes and telling the ancient stories associated with the holiday. These celebrations maintained cultural traditions that connected residents to their heritage and to each other. Christianity also found a foothold within the walled city, most notably through the work of Jackie Pullinger and the missionaries who followed her example. Pullinger had arrived in Hong Kong in 1966 and found her way to the walled city, where she established a youth club that became the foundation for a broader ministry. Her approach combined practical assistance with religious instruction, and over the decades she helped hundreds of drug addicts overcome their dependencies and rebuild their lives. The drug addiction problem in the walled city was severe, a legacy of the Triad era when opium dens had operated openly throughout the settlement. Even after the police raids of the 1970s drove most of the drug trade underground, many residents remained trapped in addiction. Pullinger and her colleagues worked with these individuals, offering them support that combined spiritual guidance with the physical and emotional care they needed to recover. The pattern of addiction in the walled city reflected the settlement's broader history. During the years of triad control, opium and later heroin had been readily available throughout the settlement. The stress of life in such cramped conditions, combined with the easy availability of drugs and the absence of any intervention services, created the perfect conditions for addiction to flourish. By some estimates, a significant percentage of the adult male population was dependent on one substance or another. The withdrawal process from opiates is physically agonizing and psychologically devastating. Addicts who tried to quit on their own often found themselves unable to endure the symptoms, returning to drug use simply to escape the torment of withdrawal. The lack of medical facilities capable of managing the process meant that few addicts had any realistic chance of recovery through willpower alone. Pulling's approach was different. She and her team would work with addicts through the entire withdrawal process, providing physical care, emotional support, and spiritual guidance. They would stay with individuals as they suffered through the worst of the symptoms, helping them understand that the pain was temporary and that recovery was possible. Many of those she worked with reported that this combination of practical care and faith had saved their lives. The success of this ministry challenged simplistic narratives about the walled city as a place of unrelenting darkness. Here was evidence that even in the most difficult circumstances, individuals and communities could find meaning and purpose. The church that Pullinger established continued its work throughout the walled city's final years, and many of those it helped went on to lead productive lives after the settlement was demolished. The contrast between the walled city's external reputation and its internal reality was one of its most striking features. From outside, the settlement appeared to be nothing but a slum, a haven for criminals and a symbol of urban decay. Publications in Hong Kong and around the world portrayed it as a lawless wasteland where respectable people dared not venture. This narrative was not entirely wrong, but it was deeply incomplete. The ordinary families who made up the majority of the walled city's population rarely appeared in these external accounts. The mothers who cooked meals for their children, the fathers who worked long hours in factories, the grandparents who watched the little ones while the parents were at work, these people were invisible to those who saw only crime and squalor. Their lives were difficult by any standard, but they were lives nonetheless, full of the same joys and sorrows, hopes and fears, that characterize human existence everywhere. The economy of the walled city was as improvised as its architecture, an ecosystem of small businesses and informal employment that provided livelihoods for thousands of families. The factories that operated throughout the settlement produced goods ranging from food products to plastic items to textiles. These enterprises took advantage of the walled city's unique status to avoid the regulations that applied to businesses elsewhere in Hong Kong. The economic ecosystem of the walled city demonstrated what happens when market forces operate without regulatory constraints. Businesses could start with minimal capital because there were no permits to obtain, no inspections to pass, no taxes to pay. The low barriers to entry meant that anyone with an idea and willingness to work could attempt to build a business. Many failed, but those that succeeded provided both employment and essential services to the community. The absence of regulation cut both ways. It allowed entrepreneurship to flourish, but it also meant that workers lacked protections that would have been guaranteed elsewhere. Wages were often low, hours were long, and working conditions could be dangerous. Children sometimes worked alongside adults in the factories, contributing to family income but missing educational opportunities. The informal economy provided a ladder that some could climb to better circumstances, but it also trapped others in cycles of exploitation. Food production was one of the most significant industries. Small workshops turned out fresh noodles, fish balls, wontons, and other items that were sold both within the settlement and to restaurants and shops throughout Hong Kong. The lack of health inspections concerned outside observers, but the producers generally maintained reasonable standards because their reputation and livelihood depended on the quality of their products. Bad food meant lost customers, a punishment more immediate and effective than any government regulation. The food production industry of the walled city illustrated the complex relationship between regulation and quality. Without government inspectors, producers had to maintain standards through market discipline rather than legal mandate. The feedback was immediate and personal. A batch of bad fish balls would result in sick customers who would never return and who would warn their neighbors. Producers who valued their reputations maintained cleanliness and quality even in the absence of official requirements. The production of roasted meats was another walled city specialty. Small kitchens turned out char siu, roast duck, and roast goose that were hung in the windows of shops and sold to customers who lined up daily for these favorites of Cantonese cuisine. The smoky smell of these operations mingled with all the other odors of the settlement, adding a pleasant note to the complex olfactory landscape. The roast meat shops were among the most successful businesses in the walled city, with some suppliers developing reputations that extended far beyond the settlement's boundaries. Customers from across Hong Kong would make the journey to purchase meats that they considered superior to what was available from licensed shops outside. The skill of the cooks, honed over decades of practice, produced results that could not be replicated in more regulated environments where efficiency and standardization took precedence over craft. Fish ball production was particularly significant, with several walled city workshops supplying restaurants across Hong Kong. The process involved grinding fresh fish into paste, then shaping it into balls that were cooked and sold to customers. The fish used was often the less desirable parts of the catch, transformed through skill and labor into a product that commanded good prices in the city's restaurants and street food stalls. The fish ball trade illustrated the economic connections between the walled city and the broader Hong Kong economy. The settlement was not isolated from the city around it but was deeply integrated into supply chains and market relationships. Fishermen sold their catch to walled city processors who sold their products to restaurants throughout the colony. Money flowed in from outside, supporting families and businesses within the settlement, while products flowed out to serve customers who might never have set foot within the walled city's boundaries. Beyond food production, the walled city hosted a remarkable variety of manufacturing operations. Plastic injection molding produced everything from household items to components for larger products. Textile operations produced clothing and fabric goods. Metalworking shops fabricated parts and products of various kinds. These operations were small by the standards of modern manufacturing, but collectively they provided employment for a significant portion of the settlement's population. The service industries of the walled city were equally diverse. As mentioned earlier, unlicensed doctors and dentists practiced throughout the settlement, providing medical care to residents who could not access or afford services elsewhere. Their qualifications varied enormously, from genuine professionals whose credentials were not recognized in Hong Kong to self-taught practitioners whose skills were questionable at best. The medical practitioners of the walled city occupied a complicated ethical space. On one hand, they provided essential services to people who would otherwise have had no access to healthcare. Residents who could not afford licensed doctors outside the settlement could seek treatment from unlicensed practitioners within it. For many conditions, the care they received was adequate or even good, delivered by skilled individuals whose only failing was a lack of proper certification. On the other hand, the absence of oversight meant that incompetent or unscrupulous practitioners could operate without consequence. Patients had no way to verify the qualifications of those treating them, no regulatory body to report complaints to, no malpractice system to seek redress through. When treatment went wrong, there was no recourse except to seek help from another practitioner who might be no more qualified than the first. The informal medical system provided access but not protection. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners were particularly common in the walled city, offering herbal remedies and acupuncture treatments that were rooted in centuries of practice. For many residents, these traditional approaches were more familiar and more affordable than Western medicine. The practitioners who offered them had often trained through apprenticeship, learning their skills from masters in a tradition that predated modern medical licensing. their presence in the walled city continued practices that had been marginalized elsewhere by the formalization of healthcare. The dentists of the walled city became particularly well known, their offices clustered along certain corridors in what amounted to an informal dental district. Neon signs advertised their services, promising everything from simple extractions to complex dental work at prices far below those charged by licensed practitioners outside. Patients accepted the risk of treatment by unlicensed providers because the alternative, going without dental care entirely, was even less appealing. The dental district of the walled city attracted patients from far beyond the settlement's boundaries. Working-class Hong Kong residents who could not afford the fees charged by licensed dentists would make the journey to the walled city, willing to accept the risks in exchange for affordable care. The prices were low because the dentists paid no rent to the government, employed no certified staff, and used equipment that would have failed inspection anywhere else. But for patients in pain with limited resources, these compromises were acceptable. Other services filled various niches within the walled city economy. Tailors produced custom clothing for residents who wanted something better than the mass-produced items available in shops. Repair shops fixed everything from watches to electronics to small appliances. Tutors offered lessons to students preparing for the examinations that would determine their educational futures. The informal economy was remarkably complete, providing almost everything residents might need without requiring them to venture outside the settlement's boundaries. The completeness of the walled city's service economy reflected the insularity that characterized life in the settlement. Residents could go days or even weeks without leaving, finding everything they needed within the interconnected blocks. This self-sufficiency was both a strength and a limitation. It provided convenience and community but also contributed to the isolation that made residents suspicious of outside authorities and resistant to change. The question of law and order within the walled city was more complex than outside observers often assumed. While it was true that the Hong Kong police exercised little authority within the settlement, and while the Triad era had seen organized crime controlling much of daily life, the walled city was never truly lawless. Informal mechanisms of social control operated to maintain order and resolve disputes. The neighborhood associations that emerged played a crucial role in governance. These voluntary organizations, often led by respected elders or successful business people, addressed common concerns and provided a forum for resolving conflicts. When disputes arose between neighbors, the association could mediate, bringing the parties together and working toward solutions that both sides could accept. The social pressure that these organizations could bring to bear was often more effective than legal sanctions in ensuring compliance with community norms. The triads themselves, despite their criminal character, provided a form of order during their period of dominance. Their control was exploitative and often brutal, but it was also predictable. Residents who paid the required bribes and followed the unwritten rules could expect to be left alone. Businesses that made their payments and did not cause trouble could operate without interference. This was a poor substitute for legitimate governance, but it was not the complete chaos that the term lawless implies. After the police raids of the 1970s broke the Triad's power, the community developed new mechanisms for maintaining order. The mutual dependence that characterized walled city life created powerful incentives for good behavior. Someone who cheated their neighbors or caused trouble would quickly find themselves ostracized, cut off from the networks of assistance that made life in the settlement possible. This social sanction was often more effective than any legal penalty could have been. Violence, while it occurred, was less common than outside stereotypes suggested. The dense population and lack of privacy meant that few crimes could go unwitnessed. The social consequences of violence were severe, as both perpetrators and victims had to continue living in close proximity. Most residents found it in their interest to resolve conflicts peacefully, and the community provided mechanisms for doing so. The infrastructure of the walled city was a monument to improvisation and adaptation. None of the systems that modern city dwellers take for granted, reliable water supply, consistent electricity, proper sewage disposal, had been designed for this population or this density. Yet somehow, through countless individual adaptations and innovations, the settlement functioned. Water came through 8 municipal pipes that the Hong Kong government had eventually installed, providing a basic supply that was supposed to serve the entire population. This supply was never adequate, particularly for residents of upper floors where water pressure was insufficient to push water through the pipes. Many buildings supplemented the municipal supply with their own wells, drilling down to tap the aquifer beneath the city. The water from these wells was often contaminated, but residents had little choice but to use it. Storage tanks on rooftops captured water when it was available, providing reserves that could be drawn upon during interruptions in supply. These tanks, visible in any photograph of the walled city's roofscape, were essential for maintaining access to water throughout the day. Residents learned to time their water usage to periods when supply was most reliable, adjusting their routines to accommodate the vagaries of the infrastructure. Electricity reached the walled city through connections that would have horrified any licensed electrician. Residents tapped into the grid that served surrounding neighborhoods, running wires through the settlement without regard for safety standards or proper installation techniques. The resulting tangle of cables created constant fire hazards, and power outages were a regular occurrence. Yet the system worked, after a fashion, providing the electricity that powered lights, televisions, and the machinery that kept the settlement's factories running. Sewage disposal was perhaps the greatest infrastructure failure. The Hong Kong government never extended its sewer system into the walled city, leaving residents to improvise their own solutions. Waste flowed through a haphazard network of pipes that had been installed without any overall plan. Much of it eventually reached Kowloon Bay, contributing to pollution that affected the entire harbor. The smell was an ever-present reminder of this inadequacy. The absence of proper infrastructure contributed to health problems that plagued many walled city residents. Respiratory illness was common, caused by poor air quality and the constant dampness of the lower floors. Gastrointestinal disorders resulted from contaminated water and inadequate sewage disposal. Skin conditions thrived in the humid, overcrowded environment. These problems were exacerbated by the difficulty of accessing proper medical care, with many residents relying on the unlicensed practitioners who operated within the settlement. Despite these challenges, the residents of the walled city managed to create lives of remarkable normalcy within their extraordinary circumstances. Children went to school, some within the settlement and others at institutions outside. Parents worked to provide for their families. Elderly residents maintained their routines, practicing their Tai Chi and gossiping with neighbors. The human capacity for adaptation was on full display in every corridor and on every rooftop. The decision to demolish the walled city, announced in January 1987, was the culmination of decades of official frustration with this ungovernable enclave. Both the British colonial administration and the Chinese government, which would take control of Hong Kong in 1997, agreed that the settlement had to go. Its anomalous status was an embarrassment, a reminder of colonial-era disputes that both sides preferred to forget. The announcement sparked complex reactions within the walled city. Some residents welcomed the prospect of relocation to modern housing with proper facilities. They had lived in difficult conditions not by choice but because they had no other options, and they were ready for something better. Others were more conflicted, attached to the community they had built and uncertain about what the future would hold. The compensation negotiations that followed were contentious and prolonged. The government initially offered amounts that many residents considered inadequate, particularly given the astronomical property values that prevailed in Hong Kong. Landlords who had built and maintained buildings over decades demanded fair value for their investments. Tenants wanted assurance that they would be able to afford housing elsewhere. Business owners faced the loss of their livelihoods and sought compensation for that loss. The complexity of ownership claims within the walled city made these negotiations particularly difficult. In a settlement where construction had proceeded without permits, where buildings had merged and evolved over decades, where documentation was often lacking, determining who owned what was a formidable challenge. Families who had lived in the same space for generations might have no formal title to show for it. Landlords who had collected rent for years might find their claims challenged by tenants or neighbors. The total cost of compensation eventually reached approximately 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars, reflecting the difficulty of settling these competing claims. The figure was enormous by the standards of the time, but critics argued that it still undervalued the losses that residents would suffer. The money could replace their housing but not the community they had built or the social networks that had sustained them through decades of hardship. The eviction process began in November 1991 and continued until July 1992. Most residents left peacefully, accepting their compensation and relocating to public housing estates scattered across Hong Kong. The estates were modern and clean, with reliable water and electricity and proper sewage systems. They were also, in many ways, less vibrant than the settlement that residents were leaving behind. The dense social networks of the walled city could not be easily recreated in these new surroundings. Some residents refused to leave, either because they felt the compensation was insufficient or because they could not imagine living anywhere else. The walled city had been their home for decades, and they were not willing to abandon it without a fight. Police eventually removed these holdouts, bringing to an end a human presence that had continued on the site for over a century. Demolition began on March 23, 1993, with a ceremony attended by government officials and former residents. Construction crews moved in with heavy equipment, and the work of dismantling the walled city began. Building by building, floor by floor, the massive structure was taken apart. The process would continue for more than a year, finally concluding in April 1994. The demolition was an enormous undertaking that revealed the true complexity of what had been built over the preceding decades. The interconnected nature of the buildings meant that each structure had to be carefully evaluated before removal to ensure that taking it down would not trigger collapses elsewhere. Workers discovered that some buildings were so intertwined with their neighbors that they could not be removed independently but had to be taken down as a unit. The demolition also produced enormous quantities of debris that had to be removed and disposed of. The concrete and steel that had sheltered tens of thousands of people was broken down, loaded onto trucks, and hauled away to landfills and recycling facilities. The process generated dust and noise that affected the surrounding neighborhood for months, a final imposition from a settlement that had long been a source of complaint for its neighbors. Archaeologists worked alongside the demolition crews, salvaging artifacts and documenting discoveries before they were lost forever. They found remnants of the original Qing dynasty fortifications that had been incorporated into later buildings. They discovered evidence of the settlement's various phases, from the modest structures of the early post-war period to the towering blocks that had been erected as the population grew. They recovered household items and personal possessions that had been abandoned or forgotten, material evidence of the lives that had been lived within these walls. The demolition revealed layers of history that had accumulated over decades of construction. Workers found remnants of the original Qing dynasty fortifications that had been incorporated into later buildings. They discovered evidence of the settlement's various phases, from the modest structures of the early post-war period to the towering blocks that had been erected as the population grew. Archaeologists salvaged what they could, preserving fragments of a place that would soon exist only in memory. Where the walled city had stood, there was now only a cleared site awaiting transformation. The Hong Kong government decided to convert the area into a public park, creating green space in a district that sorely needed it. The design would acknowledge the site's history while serving the contemporary needs of the community. Kowloon Walled City Park opened on December 22, 1995, just under 2 years after demolition began. The design followed the Jiangnan garden style of the early Qing dynasty, deliberately connecting the park to the period when the original fortification had been built. Pavilions, bridges, and carefully arranged plantings created a serene environment that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. The transformation from densely packed settlement to tranquil garden was deliberate and symbolic. The Hong Kong government wanted to erase the memory of what the walled city had represented, replacing images of crime and squalor with visions of beauty and order. The Jiangnan style was chosen specifically because it evoked a classical Chinese aesthetic, connecting the site to its imperial origins while distancing it from its more recent and more troubling history. The park designers faced the challenge of creating a meaningful space on land that had been so heavily built upon. The foundations of the walled city's buildings had disturbed the soil to considerable depth, and archaeological concerns limited what could be planted where. The solution was to work with these constraints, incorporating exposed foundations and archaeological features into the park design rather than attempting to hide them. The result was a park that served multiple purposes simultaneously. For casual visitors, it provided a pleasant green space in a neighborhood that desperately needed one. For those interested in history, it offered physical connections to the site's past. For former residents, it served as a memorial to a community that no longer existed. And for urban planners and historians, it became a case study in how cities remember and forget their pasts. Within the park, traces of the walled city's history were preserved for future generations. Remnants of the South Gate, one of the original entrances to the Qing-era fort, had survived the decades of informal development and were incorporated into the park design. A portion of the original stone wall foundations was excavated and left exposed, allowing visitors to appreciate the scale of the fortification that had once defended this site. The Yamen building, which had survived the Japanese occupation and decades of walled city development, was restored and turned into a museum exhibit. The restoration of the Yamen was particularly significant because it connected the park to the site's oldest continuous presence. This building had served as the seat of Qing dynasty administration, had hosted the charitable institutions established by the Holy Trinity Church, had witnessed the arrival of refugees and the rise and fall of triad control. Its walls had seen centuries of history pass, and its restoration allowed that history to continue speaking to new generations. The museum displayed photographs, artifacts, and interpretive materials that told the story of the site from its origins as a military outpost through its transformation into the most densely populated place on Earth. Former residents were consulted in the development of the exhibits, ensuring that their perspectives and memories were represented. The museum became a pilgrimage site for those who had once lived in the walled city, a place where they could reconnect with a past that had otherwise been completely erased. The exhibits walked a careful line between acknowledging the walled city's problems and respecting the dignity of those who had lived there. Early proposals for the museum had emphasized crime and squalor, presenting the settlement as an example of urban failure that government intervention had corrected. Former residents objected to this framing, arguing that it ignored the community and resilience that had characterized their home. The final exhibits attempted to present a more balanced picture, acknowledging hardships while also celebrating the human spirit that had flourished within them. The legacy of the Kowloon walled city extends far beyond the boundaries of the park that now occupies its site. The settlement has become a subject of intense interest among architects, urban planners, and sociologists who see in it lessons about how humans organize themselves in the absence of formal governance. The photographs and maps produced during the settlement's final years have been studied extensively, revealing patterns and structures that were not apparent to casual observers. The academic study of the walled city has produced a substantial body of scholarship that examines the settlement from multiple perspectives. Architects have analyzed the structural innovations that allowed the buildings to rise so high and remain stable despite their improvised construction. Urban planners have studied the patterns of land use that emerged without any formal planning process. Sociologists have examined the community structures that developed in the absence of government services. Each discipline finds in the walled city a unique case study that challenges assumptions and inspires new thinking. The cross-section drawings and detailed maps produced by Japanese architects Hitomi Terasawa, Miyuki Yamashita, Greg Girard, and Ian Lambot have become iconic images that are reproduced in countless academic papers, popular articles, and design publications. These drawings reveal the incredible density and complexity of the walled city's internal structure, showing how buildings connected and interlocked in 3 dimensions. They have influenced architects and designers around the world, inspiring approaches to density and mixed-use development that were once considered impossible. For architects, the walled city demonstrated what happens when construction is allowed to respond purely to immediate needs without long-term planning. The result was both horrifying and fascinating, a structure that violated every principle of good design and yet somehow functioned. The organic growth of the settlement, with each addition responding to existing conditions rather than following a master plan, created spaces that were uniquely suited to the lives of residents. The lessons are not that planning should be abandoned, but that planning must account for the ways that actual users will adapt and modify the environments that are created for them. The influence of the walled city on architectural thinking extends to contemporary discussions of density and sustainability. As cities around the world grapple with the challenges of housing growing populations within limited space, the walled city offers a reference point for what maximum density actually looks like. While no one advocates recreating its conditions, understanding how it functioned helps planners think more creatively about what is possible. Urban planners have found in the walled city a cautionary tale about what happens when governments abandon their responsibilities. The Hong Kong administration's hands-off approach created a pocket of deprivation in the midst of one of the world's most prosperous cities. The absence of building codes, health regulations, and police protection meant that the most vulnerable residents bore the costs of this neglect. Whatever sense of community developed within the settlement, it was built on a foundation of inadequate infrastructure and social services that left many residents suffering unnecessarily. Sociologists have studied the walled city as an example of community formation under extreme conditions. The mutual dependence that characterized life in the settlement created social bonds that were in some ways stronger than those found in more comfortable environments. Residents had no choice but to cooperate, to look out for one another, to create informal institutions that filled the gaps left by absent government. The resulting community was flawed and fragile, but it was also genuine. The walled city has found a second life in popular culture, its distinctive aesthetic and unique history inspiring creative works across multiple media. Video game designers have been particularly drawn to the settlement, finding in its dense verticality and chaotic organization perfect material for immersive game environments. The original Kowloon's Gate, released in 1997, created a digital recreation that allowed players to explore spaces inspired by the real settlement. Subsequent games have continued to draw on the walled city for visual inspiration and atmospheric reference. Cinema has embraced the walled city as well, using it as a setting for action sequences and as a visual reference for futures both dystopian and merely chaotic. Hong Kong films shot scenes in the settlement during its final years, capturing images that would become impossible once demolition began. International productions discovered the walled city as a shorthand for urban decay, a place whose mere existence suggested the failure of orderly governance. The influence of the walled city on Hong Kong cinema was particularly significant. The local film industry had long used the settlement as a backdrop for crime dramas and action films, taking advantage of its distinctive visual character and its association with the triad underworld. Directors appreciated the authentic atmosphere that only the real walled city could provide, the cramped corridors and looming buildings creating a visual intensity that studio sets could never match. Jackie Chan, one of Hong Kong's most famous film stars, shot portions of Crime Story within the walled city just months before demolition began. The film captured the settlement in its final days, preserving images of corridors and rooftops that would soon cease to exist. For viewers today, these sequences serve as a documentary record as much as entertainment, a glimpse into a world that has vanished completely. International filmmakers discovered the walled city as well, though often through indirect means. The settlement's influence can be seen in the dystopian cityscapes of countless science fiction films, where towering structures block out the sky and humanity lives in cramped warrens that echo the walled city's density. The aesthetic of vertical slums and improvised infrastructure that has become so common in speculative fiction owes a significant debt to the real settlement that once stood in Hong Kong. Anime and manga artists have found in the walled city a rich source of visual inspiration. The dense layering of buildings, the tangle of wires and pipes, the mixing of residential, commercial, and industrial uses, these elements have been incorporated into countless fictional worlds. The influence extends beyond direct homage to a general aesthetic of organic urban density that has become a recognized visual language in Asian popular culture. The most famous anime reference to the walled city is probably found in Ghost in the Shell, whose creators have acknowledged the settlement as an influence on the film's visual design. The movie's depictions of densely packed urban environments, where technology and humanity intermingle in chaotic profusion, draw directly on the visual vocabulary of the walled city. The influence has spread from there to countless other works in anime, manga, and beyond. Writers have attempted to capture the experience of living in the walled city through fiction and journalism. The most successful of these works convey not just the physical conditions of the settlement but the human stories that unfolded within its corridors. The voices of former residents, recorded in oral histories and journalistic accounts, provide testimony to lives that might otherwise be forgotten. Their memories ensure that the walled city exists as more than just an architectural curiosity. The photographic record of the walled city has become increasingly valuable as years pass since the settlement's demolition. Photographers who documented the settlement in its final years, including Greg Girard and Ian Lambert, whose work was compiled in the definitive book City of Darkness, have created an archive of images that allows contemporary viewers to experience something of what the walled city was like. Their photographs reveal not just the physical environment but the human presence within it, residents going about their daily lives in this most unusual of settings. The questions raised by the Kowloon walled city remain relevant as urbanization continues to transform the world. More than half of humanity now lives in cities, and that proportion continues to grow. In many parts of the developing world, this growth is outpacing the capacity of formal planning systems, leading to the emergence of informal settlements that share some characteristics with the walled city. Understanding how the walled city functioned and how it failed offers insights that may help address these contemporary challenges. The informal settlements that house millions of people in cities across Africa, Asia, and Latin America face many of the same challenges that the walled city faced. They lack proper infrastructure, with inadequate water supply, unreliable electricity, and non-existent sewage systems. They are built without permits or inspections, using whatever materials are available and whatever construction techniques residents can manage. They exist in legal grey zones, their residents often lacking formal title to the land they occupy and the structures they have built. But these settlements also demonstrate the same resilience and adaptability that characterized the walled city. Residents create their own infrastructure when governments fail to provide it. They develop social networks that provide mutual support in the absence of formal services. They establish businesses that serve local needs, creating economic ecosystems that operate outside the formal economy but that are nonetheless productive and valuable. The challenge for policymakers is to find ways to support these communities without destroying what makes them function. The walled city was demolished because it was seen as an embarrassment and a problem, but the demolition displaced tens of thousands of people and destroyed a community that had developed over decades. Whether this was the right decision remains a matter of debate, but the question of how to address informal settlements is one that cities around the world continue to grapple with. The balance between order and chaos, between planning and organic growth, between government authority and community self-organization, These tensions were all on display in the walled city. The settlement demonstrated both the remarkable adaptability of human communities and the costs that are paid when that adaptability is the only resource available. The lessons are not simple, but they are important. As the years pass, living memory of the walled city fades. The residents who knew the settlement in its prime are aging, and many have already passed. The children who played on its rooftops are now middle-aged, their memories increasingly distant. Soon the walled city will exist only in photographs, documents, and the creative works it has inspired. The physical evidence of its existence has been almost entirely erased, replaced by the carefully manicured landscape of the park. The loss of living memory represents a critical transition in how the walled city is understood and remembered. When former residents could share their experiences directly, the settlement existed as more than just images and statistics. Their stories conveyed the texture of daily life in ways that photographs and documents cannot capture. They could describe the sounds of the corridors, the smells of the kitchens, the feel of navigating those narrow passages. As these voices fall silent, the walled city becomes increasingly abstract, an object of study rather than a lived experience. Some efforts have been made to preserve the memories of former residents before they are lost. Oral history projects have recorded interviews with dozens of people who lived in the walled city, creating an archive of personal testimony that future generations can access. These recordings capture not just facts about the settlement but the emotions and perspectives of those who experienced it. They convey pride in the community that residents built, nostalgia for relationships that cannot be recreated, and ambivalence about a place that was both home and hardship. The reunions of former residents that occasionally take place serve a similar preservative function. When elderly men and women gather to remember the place where they grew up, they reinforce and refine their collective memories. Stories are shared and corrected, details are recalled and verified, and a consensus emerges about what the walled city was really like. These gatherings will become increasingly rare as the population of former residents dwindles, making each one more precious than the last. And yet the walled city continues to exert its strange fascination. People who never saw it, who were not born when it stood, become captivated by its story and its images. There is something in the settlement that speaks to enduring human concerns about community, about autonomy, about what happens when individuals are left to create order for themselves. The walled city was an accidental experiment in human organization, and its results continue to be studied and debated. The ongoing fascination with the walled city reflects broader anxieties about modern urban life. In an era when cities are increasingly planned and regulated, where every aspect of the built environment is subject to codes and reviews and approvals, the walled city represents a road not taken. It suggests that other ways of organizing human settlement are possible, that the particular forms our cities take are choices rather than necessities. Whether those alternatives would be better or worse is a question that the walled city helps us consider. Perhaps what makes the walled city so compelling is that it existed at all. In a world increasingly organized, regulated, and controlled, here was a place that defied all those tendencies. For nearly half a century, tens of thousands of people lived their lives in this space that no government fully claimed. They raised families, built businesses, created communities, practiced faiths, and pursued dreams in conditions that would seem impossible to outsiders. Their success, partial and compromised though it was, suggests that human beings are capable of more than the systems designed to govern them often assume. The contrast between the walled city and the orderly developments that surround its former site is instructive. The modern buildings of Kowloon City are clean, safe, and efficient, products of the same planning processes that govern development throughout Hong Kong. They provide reliable services and predictable environments. But they lack something that the walled city possessed, a sense of organic vitality, of spaces shaped by human needs rather than administrative requirements. The trade-off between order and spontaneity is one that every society must negotiate. The story of the Kowloon walled city is not a simple morality tale about the need for regulation or the virtue of self-reliance. It is a complicated human story about adaptation and survival, about community and exploitation, about ingenuity and suffering. The people who lived there were not heroes or victims but ordinary individuals responding to the circumstances they found themselves in. Their story deserves to be remembered in all its complexity. As you rest now, letting these final thoughts settle into your mind, perhaps you find yourself imagining the site as it exists today. The peaceful gardens where children once dodged traffic and debris. The carefully maintained lawns where factories once hummed with activity. The restored yamen where scholars now study history that their grandparents lived. The transformation is complete, but the memory endures. The walled city stands as a reminder that human settlements are more than physical structures. They are networks of relationships, collections of memories, repositories of stories that persist even when the buildings themselves are gone. The concrete and steel that once rose from this site have been removed, but the walled city continues to exist in the minds of those who knew it and in the imaginations of those who have discovered it through the accounts that survive. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of the most remarkable places that ever existed. The Kowloon walled city may be gone, but its story remains, a testament to human adaptability and a reminder that communities can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances. Sleep well now, and may your dreams carry you to places as fascinating as this one. If you enjoyed this journey into history, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment below. Your support helps us continue creating these nocturnal explorations for sleepy travelers like yourself. Until next time, rest peacefully, and remember that even the most chaotic places in history were home to people seeking the same things we all seek: connection, security, and a place to call their own. Good night.